The day Annabelle Norwood shot a man was the day that most folks in Redemption Springs said she'd ruined herself for good. Not that it mattered to her anymore. The whispers had started long before the smoking gun ever touched her trembling hand. Spring 1878 had brought more than wildflowers to the parched Arizona territory. It had brought the rains, the cattle drives, and for Annabelle, the culmination of 3 years of quiet suffering since her father had died, leaving her alone with the small ranch and the enormous debts that threatened to swallow it whole. The town's mercantile bell jingled as she stepped inside, clutching her last few coins. The conversations died as they always did these days, like candles snuffed by a sudden gust. Women gathered their skirts to avoid brushing against her. Men stared too long, their gazes weighted with something that turned her stomach. "Miss Norwood," Mr. Peterson, the shopkeeper, acknowledged her with the barest nod. His wife stood behind him, her lips pinched into a disapproving line. "I need flour, coffee, and beans," Annabelle said, her voice steady despite the knot in her throat. "And whatever ammunition you can spare for this." She placed her father's worn Remington revolver on the counter. Peterson's eyebrows rose. "Don't think a lady like you ought to be handling firearms." "A lady like me," Annabelle repeated softly. The phrase hung in the air, heavy with implication. Everyone knew what they called her when they thought she couldn't hear: ruined, soiled, fallen. All because she'd done what was necessary to keep her land after Frederick Chambers, the bank owner, had made it clear there was only one way she could extend her loan payments. One night that haunted her still, and which had spread through town like wildfire, twisting into something far uglier than the truth. "I need the ammunition," she said again, firmer this time. Peterson reluctantly measured out her purchases, taking her coins with the tips of his fingers as if her touch might contaminate him. As Annabelle gathered her meager supplies, the shop door swung open with such force that it banged against the wall. The entire room stilled at the sight of the newcomer, a tall man with shoulders broad enough to fill the doorframe. His face was shadowed beneath a dusty hat, but there was no mistaking Frederick Chambers' walking cane or his entitled swagger. "Annabelle," he said, her name a command on his lips. "I believe it's time we discussed your final payment." Her fingers tightened around the paper-wrapped parcel in her arms. "I've got 3 more days." Chambers smiled, the expression never reaching his eyes. "I'm afraid circumstances have changed. The bank requires immediate settlement." Every eye in the mercantile watched, hungry for the drama unfolding before them. Annabelle felt the weight of the loaded Remington in her skirt pocket. "You gave me until the 1st of the month," she said. "Did I?" Chambers moved closer, lowering his voice. "Perhaps we should revisit our previous arrangement. It worked so well the first time." Something in Annabelle snapped. 3 years of whispers, of sidelong glances, of being treated like something less than human because she'd sacrificed her reputation to save her father's legacy. The gun was in her hand before she could think twice. "Stay back," she warned. Chambers laughed. "What are you going to do, shoot me in front of the whole town?" He reached for her arm. The blast echoed through the mercantile. Chambers howled, clutching his leg where blood bloomed through his expensive trousers. "You crazy bitch," he screamed. "You shot me." Annabelle stood frozen, the smoking gun still pointed at the man who had destroyed her life. "Someone get the sheriff," Mrs. Peterson shrieked. Annabelle backed toward the door. "He gave me no choice." But she knew it didn't matter. In a town like Redemption Springs, a woman who shot a man, even a man like Frederick Chambers, was beyond redemption. She just confirmed what everyone already thought. Annabelle Norwood was ruined for good. The sheriff arrived within minutes, his weathered face grim as he assessed the situation. Chambers was moaning dramatically, surrounded by a cluster of concerned townspeople. "She tried to kill me, Sheriff." Chambers pointed a shaking finger at Annabelle. "Unprovoked attack." "That ain't true," Annabelle said, her voice carrying despite its softness. She hadn't lowered the Remington. "He threatened me." Sheriff Davis looked between them, his expression unreadable. "Miss Norwood, I'm going to need you to put that gun down. If I do, you'll arrest me," she said. "And we both know what happens to women in your jail." The sheriff had the decency to look uncomfortable. His deputy, a young man with more ambition than sense, had developed a reputation for visiting female prisoners after hours. "I give you my word," the sheriff began. "Your word ain't worth much these days, Davis," came a deep voice from the doorway. Every head turned toward the newcomer. He stood with his back to the light, a tall silhouette framed by the afternoon sun. As he stepped inside, Annabelle saw a face weathered by sun and wind, with eyes the color of a summer storm. He wore simple clothes dusty from the trail and a gun belt that had seen hard use. "Brody Grayson," the sheriff acknowledged, tension evident in his voice. "Thought you were still down Mexico way." "Got bored," the stranger Brody replied with a casual shrug. His gaze shifted to Annabelle, then to Chambers on the floor. "Trouble? None of your concern," Chambers spat. "This woman is deranged. She shot me without provocation." Brody considered this, head tilted. "Miss," he addressed Annabelle, "did you shoot this man?" Annabelle lifted her chin. "I did. Any particular reason?" He threatened me, tried to force himself on me. Again, a murmur rippled through the onlookers. Brody's expression remained unchanged, but something flickered in those storm-gray eyes. "Lies." Chambers struggled to stand. "She's a lying whore. Everyone knows what she is." Brody moved with surprising speed for a man his size. Before anyone could react, he had Chambers by the collar, lifting him nearly off his feet despite the wounded leg. "That's no way to speak to a lady," he said, his voice deadly quiet. "Lady," Chambers sneered. "She's ruined. Ask anyone in town." Brody released him so suddenly that Chambers stumbled back against the counter. The cowboy turned to Annabelle, studying her with a gaze that seemed to see straight through her defenses. "Then I'll love what's left and make it whole," he said, loud enough for everyone to hear. The mercantile went utterly silent. Annabelle stared at him, unable to process his words. "What?" she finally managed. Brody smiled, a genuine expression that transformed his rugged face. "Miss, I don't know you or your troubles, but I know a desperate situation when I see one." He turned to Sheriff Davis. "I'm claiming this woman under frontier law." The sheriff looked bewildered. "What law would that be?" "The one that says I'm taking responsibility for her actions from here on out." Brody removed his hat, revealing dark hair streaked with silver at the temples. "I'll pay for this man's medical care and any damages to the store. In exchange, the lady comes with me." "You can't do that," Chambers protested. "Actually, he can," the sheriff said slowly. "It's an old custom, rarely used these days, but legal enough." He looked at Annabelle. "Miss Norwood would have to agree, though." Every eye turned to her. Annabelle knew what awaited if she refused: jail, disgrace, possibly worse. Her ranch would certainly be lost. This stranger offered, what, another kind of servitude. Yet something in his eyes, something she couldn't name, made her hesitate to refuse. "I don't even know you," she said. "Brody Grayson, cattle rancher from up north, down here buying stock." He extended a calloused hand. "And you are Annabelle Norwood." "Well, Miss Norwood, I reckon you've got a choice to make. Quick-like would be best." Annabelle looked around at the faces watching her, some curious, some disgusted, none friendly, then back to Brody Grayson with his storm-gray eyes and impossible offer. "I have a ranch," she said. "I won't abandon it. Then we'll sort that out too." His hand remained extended. "What's it gonna be?" Annabelle took a deep breath, said a silent prayer, and placed her hand in his. "I accept your offer, Mr. Grayson." His fingers closed around hers, warm and strong. "Good." "Sheriff, I believe we have an understanding." Sheriff Davis nodded reluctantly. "Get her out of town, Grayson, and settle with Chambers before sundown." "Gladly." Brody released Annabelle's hand and turned to the banker. "I'll have the doctor look at that scratch, then we'll discuss fair compensation. Though I suspect your silence on this matter might be worth more than any dollar amount." Chambers' face flushed with fury. "This isn't over." "Oh, I believe it is," Brody replied pleasantly. "Unless you'd prefer I mention certain business dealings of yours that might interest the territorial marshal." The banker paled. Brody nodded, satisfied, and turned back to Annabelle. "Shall we, Miss Norwood?" Dazed, Annabelle allowed him to escort her from the mercantile, aware of the stunned silence they left behind. Outside, the afternoon sun was blinding after the dim interior. "My wagon's down at the livery," she said. I need to collect it before we head to your ranch. Brody finished for her. Lead the way. They walked in silence through the town, drawing stares from every porch and window. Annabelle kept her gaze fixed ahead, her mind spinning. What had she just agreed to? Who was this man, really? Mr. Grayson, she finally said as they reached the livery stable. I appreciate your intervention, but I need to understand what you expect in return. Brody stopped, turning to face her fully. Up close, she could see the fine lines around his eyes, the small scar that ran along his jawline. He wasn't a young man, but there was strength in him, and something else, a kindness that seemed at odds with his rough exterior. Miss Norwood, I expect nothing from you that you're not willing to give freely. My offer was exactly as stated. I'll take responsibility for today's events, help you sort out your troubles, and then, if you wish, I'll be on my way. Why would you do that for a stranger, a ruined woman, as they say? His expression darkened. I've lived long enough to know that people, especially small-minded townfolk, rarely know the full truth of another's circumstances. Whatever happened to bring you to this point, I doubt very much it justifies how they've treated you. Annabelle studied him, searching for deceit but finding none. You said something back there about loving what's left. A faint flush colored his tan cheeks, a figure of speech, perhaps poorly chosen in the heat of the moment. It was kind, she said softly, kinder than anything I've heard in this town for a very long time. Something passed between them then, a moment of understanding that transcended their brief acquaintance. Then Brody cleared his throat and gestured toward the livery. Let's get your wagon. We should be clear of town before people start getting ideas about what just happened. As they led her horse and wagon out of the stable, Annabelle felt a strange sense of lightness, as if a burden she'd carried for years had shifted, if not lifted entirely. My ranch is about 5 miles east, she told him as he helped her up to the wagon seat. It's not much to look at these days. Most things worth having rarely are at first glance, Brody replied, mounting his own horse, a magnificent bay stallion that made her tired mare look particularly shabby. Lead on, Miss Norwood. I believe we have quite a story to unravel. As they left Redemption Springs behind, Annabelle couldn't help but wonder if she'd made the biggest mistake of her life, or if, perhaps, she'd finally found a path to the redemption the town had never offered her. The journey to the Norwood ranch passed in relative silence. Annabelle stole glances at her unexpected companion, trying to reconcile his actions with her experience of men. In her 23 years, she'd learned that kindness from men usually came with conditions, painful ones. You're staring, Miss Norwood, Brody said without looking her way. Trying to figure you out, she admitted. Not much to figure. What you see is what you get. What I see is a man who just claimed responsibility for a woman he's never met, who shot someone in broad daylight. Annabelle's hands tightened on the reins. That's not normal behavior, Mr. Grayson. A smile played at the corners of his mouth. Never claimed to be normal. Are you running from the law? This time he laughed outright. No, Miss Norwood, my conscience is clear on that front. Then why help me? The truth, please. Brody was quiet for a long moment, his gaze fixed on the horizon. I know what it's like to be judged unfairly, he finally said. To have your name dragged through the mud for choices made in desperation, and I know what Chambers is. I've encountered his type before. You know him personally. Know of him? His reputation extends beyond Redemption Springs. He's ruined more than one person who stood in his way. Brody's expression hardened. Men like that count on decent folks being too afraid to stand against them. Annabelle digested this. So I'm a charity case, your good deed. You're a person who needed help. I was in a position to provide it. He glanced at her. Would you rather I hadn't? No, she admitted, but I'm not accustomed to kindness without strings. Then perhaps it's time that changed. They crested a small rise and the Norwood ranch came into view. The main house was modest, a single-story structure of weathered wood with a porch that sagged slightly on one side. A small barn and corral stood nearby, both in need of repair. Fields that had once grown hay now lay fallow, and the cattle pens held only a few scraggly beasts. Annabelle felt a flush of shame as she watched Brody take it all in. I told you it wasn't much to look at. I see good bones, he replied. Solid foundation, just needs some care. His words, though clearly about the ranch, touched something deep within her. She blinked rapidly and guided the wagon toward the house. My father built it, she said. Before the war, we had 30 head of cattle and good grazing land back then. What happened? Life, she said simply. Father came back from the war, changed, started drinking. The drought hit, we lost half our stock, and then he took sick 3 years ago. She pulled the wagon to a stop. After he died, the debts came due. Chambers was all too happy to extend the loan terms, provided I was accommodating. Brody's jaw tightened, but he asked no further questions as he dismounted and came to help her down from the wagon. His hands at her waist were impersonal, respectful, but Annabelle still felt a jolt at the contact. It had been so long since anyone had touched her with simple human kindness. I'll see to the horses, he said. You go on inside. Mr. Grayson, Brody, he corrected. If we're to be sharing space, even temporarily, we might as well use Christian names. Brody, she tried again. I need to know how long you intend to stay. He considered this. Long enough to get your ranch in working order and ensure Chambers leaves you be. After that, it's your choice whether I go or stay. And if I want you to leave tomorrow, then I'll respect that, though I'd appreciate one night's rest before heading out. His eyes crinkled. I've been riding hard for 3 days. Annabelle nodded, then headed for the house, aware of his gaze on her back. Inside, she leaned against the closed door, trying to make sense of the day's events. This morning, she'd been preparing to lose everything. Now, a stranger was unsaddling his horse in her yard, having apparently appointed himself her protector. Her home, like herself, had seen better days. She quickly straightened the sparse furnishings and swept the worst of the dust into corners. When Brody knocked a short while later, she'd managed to start a fire in the cook stove and put on coffee. Come in, she called, smoothing her hair self-consciously. He filled the doorway, his broad shoulders making the modest cabin seem suddenly smaller. He'd removed his hat and gun belt and carried a small pack over one shoulder. Hope you don't mind, he said, nodding to his belongings. Didn't want to presume, but it's getting dark. Of course, you can take my father's room. She gestured to a door off the main living area. I changed the bedding last week, so it should be adequate. Brody placed his pack by the door she'd indicated. I've slept in far worse places than this, Annabelle. Your home is fine. Her name in his deep voice sent an unexpected shiver down her spine. Coffee. She offered to cover her confusion. Please. She poured 2 cups, adding a precious spoonful of sugar to his a gesture of hospitality she couldn't quite explain to herself. They sat at the small table, the silence stretching between them until Brody finally spoke. I think we should lay out some ground rules, he said. For both our comfort, Annabelle tensed. Here it came, the conditions, the expectations. I'll sleep in the barn, he continued. Not appropriate for me to be under the same roof given the circumstances, she blinked. But I offered my father's room, and I appreciate that, but people talk and your reputation has suffered enough. He sipped his coffee. I'll help with repairs, stock, whatever needs doing. In return, I'd appreciate meals and the occasional use of your wash basin. That's all. His eyes met hers steadily. That's all. I'm a simple man with simple needs. And when Chambers comes calling, I'll handle Chambers. The edge in his voice left no doubt about his capabilities in that regard. Now, tell me what needs fixing first around here. For the next hour, they discussed the ranch, the broken fences, the leaking roof, the depleted feed stores. Brody listened intently, asking questions that revealed a deep knowledge of ranching. By the time darkness fell completely, they had a rough plan for the coming days. I should turn in, Annabelle said, suddenly aware of how intimate the small cabin felt in the lamplight. Dawn comes early. Brody nodded and rose. I'll see to my bedroll in the barn. Lock your door behind me. I haven't locked my door in years. There's nothing worth stealing here. There is now, he said simply, and the way his eyes lingered on her face made her throat go dry. After he'd gone, Annabelle moved through the familiar routine of securing her home for the night. As promised, she shot the bolt on the door not out of fear of the man in her barn, but because he'd asked her to. In her small bedroom, she changed into her nightgown and sat before the cracked mirror. brushing her hair dark blonde waves that had once been her pride. The face that looked back at her seemed different somehow, as if the day's events had altered her physically. For the first time in 3 years, there was a glimmer of something in her eyes that looked suspiciously like hope. Dawn broke with a chorus of roosters and birdsong. Annabelle dressed quickly, choosing her sturdiest work dress and pulling her hair into a practical bun. When she opened her front door, she was startled to find the porch had been swept clean and a stack of freshly split firewood piled neatly beside it. Brody was already at work in the corral, mending a broken section of fence. He'd removed his shirt in the early morning heat, and Annabelle found herself frozen in place, watching the play of muscles across his back as he worked. Scars crisscrossed his skin, some old and faded, others newer and still angry-looking, evidence of a hard life. As if sensing her presence, he turned and nodded a greeting. "Morning. You've been busy," she said, indicating the woodpile. "Couldn't sleep." He hammered another nail into place. "Figured I might as well make myself useful." Annabelle hesitated, then said, "I'm making breakfast, if you're hungry." A smile broke across his face, transforming his features. "Starving, actually. I'll call when it's ready." She hurried back inside, unsettled by her reaction to that smile. In the kitchen, she prepared a simple meal of corn cakes and the last of her bacon. It had been so long since she'd cooked for anyone but herself that she felt oddly nervous. Would he find it adequate? Would he expect more than she could provide? When Brody came in, he donned his shirt again and washed up, his dark hair damp at the temples. He took the seat she indicated and waited for her to sit before picking up his fork. "This looks mighty fine," he said. "It's not much. It's more than I'd have had on the trail." He took a bite and made an appreciative sound that sent a flush of pleasure through her. Definitely better. They ate in companionable silence. Annabelle found herself studying him when he wasn't looking, the fine lines around his eyes that suggested he smiled more than frowned, the careful way he handled her chipped plates, the calluses on his hands that spoke of years of honest work. "How old are you, Brody?" she asked suddenly. He looked up, surprised. 34 come August. Why? Just curious. You seem experienced." A corner of his mouth lifted. "That's a polite way of saying I look worn." "No," she protested, "just like you've lived a full life." "Some parts fuller than I'd have liked." He set down his fork. "What about you?" 23. Something flickered across his face. "Young to be managing a ranch alone." "Not my choice," she said simply. He nodded, understanding in his eyes. "Well, you're not alone now, at least for a while." The day unfolded in a rhythm of shared work. Annabelle mended chicken coops and tended her small vegetable garden while Brody continued repairs on the corral and barn. By midday, they were both dust-covered and sweating. "There's a creek out back," Annabelle told him when they paused for a quick meal of bread and cheese. "If you want to cool off, might take you up on that later." He wiped his brow with a bandana. "First, I want to check your roof. Saw some missing shingles. It leaks something terrible when it rains. I've been putting pots and pans everywhere. We'll fix that, we." The word warmed her in ways she couldn't explain. It had been so long since there had been a "we" in her life. As the afternoon waned, Annabelle found herself humming as she worked something she hadn't done in years. The sound of hammering from the roof provided an oddly comforting background to her tasks. This was how a ranch should be, she thought, alive with purpose and shared effort. She was so absorbed in her work that she didn't notice the approaching riders until they were almost at the house. 3 men on horseback with Frederick Chambers in the lead, his leg bandaged but his posture as arrogant as ever. "Annabelle," he called. "Come out and face me, you treacherous bitch." Her blood ran cold. Chambers had never come to the ranch before, had always insisted she come to him, to his private rooms above the bank. This was bold, even for him. "Brody," she called, trying to keep her voice steady, "we have company." He appeared at the edge of the roof, took one look at the visitors, and swung down with surprising agility, landing beside her on the porch. In one fluid motion, he retrieved his gun belt from where it hung on a nearby post. "Stay behind me," he told her, his voice calm but firm. "That's the man I shot," she whispered. "And those with him are his hired muscle." Brody nodded. "Let me handle this." Chambers and his men stopped a respectful distance from the house. The banker's face was flushed with anger or drink, possibly both. "There she is," he shouted. "The woman who tried to murder me." "You're trespassing, Chambers," Brody called back evenly. "State your business and then get off this property." Chambers sneered. "I don't recognize your authority here, Grayson. This land is all but mine anyway." "Miss Norwood is 3 months behind on her payments." "Is that so?" Brody glanced at Annabelle, who nodded reluctantly. $200, she murmured, plus his interest. Brody's jaw tightened. "You'll have your money, Chambers, in full by the end of the month," the banker laughed. "And where will you get that kind of cash? This place isn't worth half that anymore." His gaze slid to Annabelle. "Unless, of course, you're paying in other ways." Brody's hand dropped to his gun. "You want to rethink those words, friend." The men with Chambers shifted nervously, hands hovering near their weapons. Annabelle held her breath, certain she was about to witness bloodshed on her front porch. "We had an arrangement," Chambers said, addressing Annabelle directly. "Before you decided a bullet was preferable to honoring it." "Your arrangement was coercion," Brody replied before she could speak, "and it's done. Whatever hold you thought you had over Miss Norwood is finished." Chambers' face darkened. "I could have you both arrested, attempted murder and harboring a criminal." "You could try," Brody agreed pleasantly. "But then we'd have to discuss certain financial improprieties at your bank. Territorial auditors take a dim view of creative bookkeeping, I hear." The two men stared at each other, the tension palpable. Finally, Chambers looked away. $200, he said, "by the end of the month. Or I'll take this place and everything on it." He turned his horse. "And Grayson, watch your back. This territory isn't kind to strangers who meddle in local affairs." With that, he and his men rode away, leaving a cloud of dust in their wake. Annabelle realized she'd been clutching Brody's arm only when her fingers began to cramp. She released him quickly. "I'm sorry," she said. "I didn't know he'd come here." Brody holstered his gun. Men like that don't like to lose, especially not to a woman. He turned to her, his expression serious. "We need to talk about what he said, about the money." Annabelle's shoulders slumped. "It's true, I'm behind on the payments. After what happened with Chambers, I couldn't bring myself to go see him again. I was hoping to sell some stock, but—" She gestured to the few scrawny cattle in the distant pasture. $200 is a lot of money," Brody said, not unkindly, "but not impossible. I've got some saved from my last cattle drive." She stared at him. "You can't possibly be offering to pay my debts." "Consider it an investment in this ranch, in our partnership." "Partnership?" Brody ran a hand through his hair, suddenly looking uncomfortable. "Temporary arrangement, however you want to term it. You barely know me. I know enough." His eyes met hers. "I know you're someone worth helping, Annabelle Norwood." Something shifted between them in that moment, a deepening of the connection that had begun in the mercantile. Annabelle found herself unable to look away from his gaze, from the quiet certainty she found there. "Why don't we get cleaned up?" he suggested gently. "Then we can figure out our next steps." Annabelle nodded, grateful for the reprieve. "I'll heat some water for you." "No need, that creek you mentioned will do fine," he smiled. "Been a long time since I had the luxury of a creek bath." As he walked away toward the line of cottonwoods that marked the creek bed, Annabelle wondered what kind of man Brody Grayson really was, a drifter with a noble streak, or something else entirely. And why, despite everything, she felt safer with him than she had in years. The answer, she suspected, was both simpler and more complicated than she was ready to admit. The next week passed in a blur of activity. True to his word, Brody worked from dawn to dusk, repairing the ranch's neglected infrastructure. The roof no longer leaked, the chicken coop was fox-proof, and the vegetable garden had been expanded and fenced against rabbits. Together, they had mended most of the corral and begun clearing irrigation ditches to revive the hay field. More surprising than the physical transformation of the ranch was the change in Annabelle herself. She found herself laughing again, rediscovering a sense of purpose that had been buried beneath years of struggle and shame. Each morning she rose with anticipation rather than dread, eager to see what the day would bring. And then there was Brody. He remained a puzzle she couldn't quite solve, unfailingly respectful, keeping to the barn at night as promised, yet there was an undeniable tension between them that grew with each passing day. Their hands would brush as they passed tools, and she would feel that contact long after it ended. Sometimes she would look up to find him watching her with an expression that made her heart race. On the 8th day, as they sat on the porch after dinner watching the sunset paint the distant mountains, Annabelle finally found the courage to ask the question that had been troubling her. "Brody, why did you really help me that day?" He was silent for so long she thought he might not answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was low, reflective. "I knew a girl once, back in Texas. Name was Sarah." He twirled his coffee cup between his palms. "She got herself in trouble with a man a lot like Chambers. Powerful, connected, used to getting his way." Annabelle listened, barely breathing. "She fought back, shot him like you did. Difference was nobody stepped in for her." His eyes had gone distant. "They hanged her 3 days later." "Called it justice? Who was she to you?" Annabelle asked softly. "My sister." The simple words carried a weight of grief that made her heart ache. "So when I saw you in that mercantile, gun in hand and the whole town ready to throw you to the wolves, I couldn't walk away, not again." Annabelle reached out impulsively and covered his hand with hers. "I'm sorry about your sister." He turned his hand to clasp hers, rough palm against soft. "I'm sorry about what Chambers did to you." They sat in silence as darkness fell, their hands still joined, a bridge across their separate pains. "Thank you for telling me," she said finally. "Figured you deserved to know." He released her hand reluctantly. "It's getting late, I should turn in." But neither of them moved, reluctant to break the fragile intimacy of the moment. A coyote called in the distance, and the night breeze carried the scent of sage and pine. "Brody," Annabelle said suddenly, "would you play cards with me? My father and I used to play in the evenings. I miss it." His smile was soft in the fading light. "I'd like that." Inside, by lamplight, they played hand after hand of 5-card draw. Brody proved to be a formidable opponent, his face betraying nothing even with a winning hand. But Annabelle had learned to read people during her years of isolation, a survival skill in a hostile town, and soon began to spot his tells. "You tap your thumb when you've got a good hand," she told him after winning her 3rd consecutive pot of matchsticks. He looked surprised, then laughed. "No wonder you're cleaning me out. My poker face isn't what it used to be, or I'm just that good," she teased, surprising herself with her boldness. "That you are, Annabelle." There was a warmth in his voice that made her flush. As the night deepened, their conversation meandered through safer topics: favorite horses they'd owned, places they'd visited, books they'd read. Annabelle discovered that Brody had an unexpected love of poetry and had once traveled as far as San Francisco. "Did you ever think of staying there?" she asked. "In the city," he shook his head. "Too crowded, too many rules, I need space to breathe." His eyes met hers. "What about you? Ever thought of leaving here, starting fresh somewhere nobody knows your story?" "Every day," she admitted, "but this land was my father's dream. I couldn't bear to abandon it." "Dreams can change," he said quietly. "Sometimes they have to," she considered this. "I suppose mine already have. I once dreamed of a husband, children, respect in the community. Now I just want to survive. You deserve more than survival." The sincerity in his voice made her eyes sting. "Maybe, but wanting things doesn't make them possible." Brody gathered the cards, his hands deft as he shuffled. "What if I told you I might have a way to save your ranch and give you a fresh start?" "I'd say that sounds too good to be true." "Hear me out." He leaned forward, elbows on the table. "I've got a small herd up north, 30 head of good breeding stock. Was planning to sell them to a ranch in California, but plans changed. If we bring them here, combine them with your remaining cattle, we could have a viable operation within a year." Annabelle stared at him. "That's a considerable investment for a ranch you don't own. We could change that too." His eyes held her steadily. "Make it a proper partnership." "Legal-like," her heart stuttered. "What exactly are you proposing, Brody Grayson?" He seemed to choose his next words with great care. "I'm suggesting a business arrangement. My cattle, your land, shared profits, nothing more than that unless—" "Unless," she prompted when he didn't continue. "Unless someday you wanted it to be more." A flush crept up his neck. "But that would be entirely your decision, no pressure, no expectations." Annabelle's mind raced. It was a sensible solution to her financial troubles. With Brody's cattle and expertise, the ranch could thrive again. And yet, there was more to consider than just business. People would talk, she said. More than they already do. People always talk. Question is, does it matter to you what they say? She considered this. For 3 years, she'd lived under the weight of Redemption Springs' judgment, letting their whispers dictate her worth. The prospect of freedom from that burden was dizzying. I need time to think, she said finally. Brody nodded. Of course, it's a big decision. He rose from the table. I should let you rest. We've got early work tomorrow. At the door, he paused. Whatever you decide, Annabelle, know this: you've already survived the worst they could do to you. Everything from here on out is your choice, no one else's. After he left, Annabelle sat alone in the lamplight, turning his words over in her mind. Your choice. How long had it been since she truly felt in control of her own destiny? The next morning, she woke before dawn and slipped outside to watch the sunrise. The air was crisp with the promise of a hot day to come, and the eastern sky was just beginning to blush with pink and gold. She wrapped her shawl tighter around her shoulders and breathed deeply, trying to clear her mind. A sound from the barn told her Brody was already awake. Moments later, he emerged, pausing when he saw her on the porch. Early riser, he commented, approaching slowly, as if afraid of intruding. Couldn't sleep. She made room for him on the step. Been thinking about your proposal. He sat beside her, careful to maintain a respectful distance. And? I have questions, practical ones. A smile touched his lips. I'd expect nothing less. Your cattle, how soon could they be moved here, and where exactly are they now? About 2 days' ride north near Purgatory Pass. I've got a couple of men watching them, trustworthy fellows I've worked with before. Could have them here within a week. And the money for Chambers, I can cover it. Got a bank draft in my saddlebag that should satisfy him. Annabelle studied his profile in the growing light. Why are you really doing this, Brody? And please don't say it's for your sister. This goes beyond honoring her memory. He was quiet for a moment, his gaze fixed on the horizon. When I first saw you in that mercantile, standing your ground despite everything, I recognized something in you. A kind of courage that's rare. He looked at her then. The world's quick to break people like you, Annabelle. I guess I wanted to see what would happen if somebody stood with you instead. And if your investment never pays off, if the ranch fails despite everything, then we tried, together. He shrugged, better than wondering what might have been. The simplicity of his answer touched her deeply. It had been so long since anyone had believed in possibilities for her future. I'll consider your offer, she said. Seriously, consider it. His smile was like the sunrise, warm and full of promise. That's all I ask. They sat in companionable silence as the sun cleared the horizon, casting long shadows across the ranch yard. It was a moment of perfect peace, so different from the chaos that had brought them together. A peace that was shattered by the sound of approaching horses. Brody was on his feet instantly, hand going to the gun at his hip. Annabelle stood more slowly, dread coiling in her stomach as Frederick Chambers came into view, accompanied by Sheriff Davis and 2 deputies. Told you to watch your back, Brody muttered, positioning himself in front of Annabelle. Chambers reined in his horse, looking smugly triumphant despite his still bandaged leg. Good morning, Miss Norwood, Mr. Grayson. Hope we're not interrupting anything indecent. State your business, Chambers, Brody said coldly. The sheriff dismounted, looking uncomfortable. Got a warrant here, Grayson, for the arrest of Annabelle Norwood on charges of attempted murder, assault with a deadly weapon, and public endangerment. That's ridiculous, Annabelle protested. It was self-defense, not according to the witnesses, Chambers said smoothly. They all saw you draw first, unprovoked. Brody's voice was dangerously quiet. We had an understanding, Chambers. You agreed to drop this matter. I reconsidered. The banker smiled thinly. Especially after learning about your interesting history in Texas, Grayson. Seems you've got quite a reputation yourself, violent tendencies, a problem with authority. Not exactly a character witness I'd worry about. Annabelle looked at Brody, who had gone very still. What is he talking about? Nothing that matters right now, Brody replied, his eyes never leaving Chambers. Sheriff, this is harassment, plain and simple. Miss Norwood acted in self-defense against a man who has been tormenting her for years. Sheriff Davis shifted uncomfortably. Be that as it may, I've got a sworn complaint and witness statements. Have to do my job. And if I have the money to settle her debt right now, Brody reached for his saddlebag, would that change things? Chambers laughed. This isn't about money anymore, Grayson. It's about principle. No woman puts a bullet in Frederick Chambers and walks away unpunished. The sheriff approached, handcuffs dangling from his fingers. Miss Norwood, please don't make this harder than it needs to be. Annabelle felt the blood drain from her face. She knew what awaited her in the Redemption Springs jail: the leering deputy, the public humiliation, a trial that would be decided before it began. Wait, Brody said, stepping forward. Take me instead. Everyone stared at him. What? The sheriff asked. I'm confessing to the shooting. It was me, not Miss Norwood. I shot Chambers when he threatened her. Brody, no. Annabelle grabbed his arm. What are you doing? He gave her a look that silenced her protests, determined, unwavering. It's my word against the witnesses. And I'm guessing none of them got a clear look at who pulled the trigger, did they, Chambers? The banker's triumphant expression faltered slightly. You can't do this, Annabelle whispered desperately. I can and I am. Brody's voice softened. Trust me, Annabelle. Sheriff Davis looked between them, confusion evident on his weathered face. This changes things. If you're confessing. He's lying, Chambers snapped. She did it. Everyone saw her, did they? Brody challenged. Or did they see a commotion and assume the woman must be guilty? Test the Remington for my fingerprints. They'll be there because I cleaned it for Miss Norwood yesterday. This last part he directed at Annabelle with a meaningful look. She understood then he was creating reasonable doubt, giving her a chance to escape the consequences. Sheriff, this is absurd, Chambers protested. You can't possibly believe, I believe, the sheriff interrupted, that I need to sort this out properly. He sighed heavily. Mr. Grayson, I'm placing you under arrest pending investigation. Miss Norwood, you'll need to come to town too, as a witness. Brody held out his wrists calmly. Just let Miss Norwood gather a few things, and I want your word she'll be treated with respect. The sheriff nodded reluctantly. You have it. As the deputies led Brody to their horses, Annabelle caught his arm. Why? She asked, her voice breaking. Why would you do this? His eyes were gentle. Some things are worth protecting, Annabelle. Before she could respond, he was pulled away. Chambers watched the exchange with narrowed eyes, calculation replacing his initial surprise. This doesn't change anything, he told Annabelle as she prepared to follow them to town. One way or another, I'll have what's mine. She lifted her chin. You've never understood what's truly yours, Frederick. That's always been your weakness. His face darkened with anger, but she turned away, refusing to give him the satisfaction of seeing her fear. Inside, she quickly gathered a few essentials, her mind racing. Brody's sacrifice had bought her time, but for what? The answer came as she reached for her father's old strongbox, tucked beneath a loose floorboard. Inside was the deed to the ranch and something else, something that might change everything. The ride to Redemption Springs was tense, with Chambers alternating between gloating and making veiled threats about what awaited Brody in jail. Annabelle kept her expression carefully neutral, though inwardly she was calculating every possible outcome of her plan. At the sheriff's office, she watched as Brody was processed and led to a cell. His eyes met hers briefly, conveying reassurance she didn't feel. Sheriff Davis, to his credit, had placed his deputy on other duties, ensuring Annabelle would be questioned without that particular threat looming. Miss Norwood, the sheriff said once they were seated in his office, I need your statement about what happened in the mercantile that day. Of course, she replied calmly, but first I'd like to speak with Mr. Chambers, privately. Both men looked surprised. I don't think that's wise, the sheriff began. It's fine, Chambers interjected, curious. I'd be happy to hear what Miss Norwood has to say. The sheriff reluctantly left them alone, though Annabelle noted he didn't go far, just outside the door, within earshot if trouble arose. Chambers settled into the chair across from her, smug confidence radiating from him. Come to beg for your cowboy's freedom, or perhaps offer something in exchange. His gaze slid over her suggestively. Neither. Annabelle reached into her pocket and removed a folded document. "I've come to show you this." She slid the paper across the desk. Chambers unfolded it with a dismissive expression that quickly turned to shock, then fury. "Where did you get this?" he demanded, his voice a harsh whisper. "My father was many things, but careless with important matters wasn't one of them." Annabelle kept her voice steady. "He knew the kind of man you were long before I did. That's why he kept a record of your creative bookkeeping, specifically the money you embezzled from the Territorial Development Fund." Chambers' face had gone ashen. "This proves nothing, perhaps not on its own. But combined with testimony from the other businesses you've ruined, the ranchers you've cheated." She let the implication hang in the air. "The territorial marshal would certainly find it interesting. You're bluffing." "Am I?" She met his gaze unflinchingly. "I've spent 3 years believing I had no choice but to endure your abuse. I was wrong. I always had this choice, I was just too afraid to make it." Chambers glanced at the document again, calculation replacing his initial shock. "What do you want?" "Drop all charges against Brody. Cancel my debt. And never come near me or my ranch again." He laughed, though it sounded forced. "You're asking a lot for one piece of paper." "Oh, this isn't the only copy," Annabelle assured him. "And if anything happens to me or Brody, the others will find their way to very interested parties." She leaned forward. "I've been called ruined for so long that I have nothing left to lose, Frederick. Can you say the same?" The standoff stretched between them, neither willing to blink first. Finally, Chambers folded the paper and placed it in his pocket. "I'll keep this, by all means. As I said, I have others." His jaw worked as he considered his options. "The charges will be dropped," he said finally, "and your debt canceled. But understand this, you've made an enemy today, Annabelle Norwood. This territory isn't big enough for both of us." She smiled, feeling a strange calm settle over her. "Then I suggest you start packing, Frederick, because I'm not going anywhere." When the sheriff returned, Chambers announced that there had been a misunderstanding and he wished to withdraw his complaint. Sheriff Davis looked between them suspiciously, but seemed relieved to avoid the complicated situation. "And Grayson?" he asked. "Free to go," Chambers said tightly. "Immediately." Within the hour, Brody was released, his confusion evident as he was led from the cells to find Annabelle waiting calmly in the sheriff's office. "What happened?" he asked once they were alone outside the jailhouse. Annabelle linked her arm through his, aware of the stares from townspeople as they walked toward the livery where their horses waited. "Let's just say Chambers and I reached an understanding." Brody stopped, turning to face her fully. "Annabelle, what did you do?" She smiled, feeling lighter than she had in years. "I took your advice, made my own choice." His eyes searched hers, concern evident. "Did you? Are you? Safe? Yes. Free? Also yes." She squeezed his arm. "I'll explain everything on the ride home, but first." She reached up and, in full view of half the town, placed her hand against his cheek. "Thank you for being willing to sacrifice yourself for me. No one's ever done that before." He covered her hand with his own, his eyes never leaving hers. "I'd do it again in a heartbeat." Around them, people whispered and pointed, but for the first time in 3 years, Annabelle didn't care what they thought. Let them talk. She had more important things to consider, like the future suddenly opening before her, bright with possibility. "About your proposal," she said as they mounted their horses. "The business partnership." Brody looked at her cautiously. "Yes, I've decided to accept, with one condition." "Name it." "That we consider it a trial run for a more permanent arrangement." She felt heat rise in her cheeks but pressed on. "If things go well, that is." The smile that spread across his face was like sunshine after a storm, warm, bright, and full of promise. "I believe that can be arranged, Miss Norwood." As they rode out of Redemption Springs side by side, Annabelle realized that for all the town's judgment, they had been wrong about one crucial thing. She wasn't ruined at all. She was just beginning. The summer of 1878 unfolded in a rhythm of hard work and healing. True to his word, Brody sent for his cattle, which arrived under the watchful eye of 2 weathered cowboys who tipped their hats respectfully to Annabelle before continuing on their journey north. The 30 head of healthy Herefords transformed the Norwood Ranch from a struggling homestead to a promising operation. With the immediate threat of Chambers removed, they focused on rebuilding. Brody taught Annabelle modern ranching techniques he'd learned during his travels, while she shared her knowledge of the local land and climate. Together, they repaired fences, dug new irrigation channels, and planted feed crops that would sustain their growing herd through winter. The business partnership flourished, but it was the personal relationship developing between them that truly transformed the ranch. Brody continued to sleep in the barn despite Annabelle's suggestions that the house had plenty of room, his stubborn insistence on propriety both frustrating and endearing. "You know what they're saying in town," she told him one evening as they sat on the porch after dinner. August had brought spectacular sunsets, the sky ablaze with colors no painter could capture. "I can imagine," he replied, his voice dry. "They think we're living in sin out here, that I've fallen even further than before." Brody's jaw tightened. "People with empty lives fill them with empty talk." "It doesn't bother you what they say, only when it hurts you," he glanced at her. "Does it still?" Annabelle considered this. "Less than it used to. Sometimes I even find it amusing they think they know everything about me, yet they know nothing at all. That's progress." His smile was gentle. "The day you stop caring what Redemption Springs thinks is the day you're truly free." She reached for his hand, an action that had become increasingly natural over the weeks, his fingers entwined with hers without hesitation. "I've been thinking," she said, her heart suddenly racing, "about our arrangement." "Oh," his tone was carefully neutral, but she felt the slight tension in his hand. "The trial period has been informative," a smile tugged at his mouth. "Has it now?" "Very," she gathered her courage. "I think I'm ready to consider that more permanent arrangement you mentioned." Brody turned to face her fully, his eyes searching hers. "Are you sure, Annabelle? There's no rush. I'm not going anywhere." "I've spent 3 years living half a life," she said softly. "Afraid to want things, to reach for them. I don't want to waste any more time." He lifted their joined hands and pressed a kiss to her knuckles, a gesture so tender it made her breath catch. "Then I should probably do this properly." He slid from the porch step to one knee before her, still holding her hand. "Annabelle Norwood, would you do me the honor of becoming my wife, not for convenience, not for the ranch, but because I've come to love you more than I thought possible?" Tears blurred her vision. "When did that happen?" "The loving part?" His smile was crooked. "Somewhere between you pointing that Remington at Chambers and you facing down the entire town without flinching, or maybe it was watching you coax those sickly chickens back to health. Or seeing you in the morning light, hair all wild and eyes still soft with sleep." She laughed through her tears. "You've been noticing a lot. Hard not to notice everything about you." His expression grew serious. "I know my proposal isn't traditional, we've done everything backward. And I know my past isn't spotless, there are things I've done, places I've been that might make a respectable woman think twice." "Good thing I'm not considered respectable then," she quipped. He shook his head, not distracted from his purpose. "What I'm trying to say, badly, is that I may not be the husband you dreamed of as a girl. But I promise to love you honestly, protect you fiercely, and build a life with you that's better than either of us could manage alone." Annabelle reached out to touch his face, tracing the line of his jaw with gentle fingers. "They called me ruined," she said softly, "and you said you'd love what's left and make it whole. That's the most beautiful thing anyone's ever said to me." "I meant it then. I mean it now." His eyes held hers. "So, will you have me, Annabelle Norwood, rough edges and all?" "Yes," she whispered. "Yes, I will." He surged forward then, capturing her lips in a kiss that started gentle but quickly deepened with months of restrained longing. His hands cradled her face as if she were precious, breakable. Annabelle wound her arms around his neck, drawing him closer, feeling for the first time the full strength of the man who had become her protector, partner, and now future husband. When they finally broke apart, both breathing heavily, Brody rested his forehead against hers. "Been wanting to do that since I first saw you, even with a smoking gun in my hand, especially then." His grin was boyish. "You were magnificent," she laughed, feeling lightheaded with joy. "So when shall we do this? Get married, I mean." Whenever you want, however you want." He tucked a strand of hair behind her ear. "Though I should warn you, I don't think Redemption Springs will be rolling out the welcome mat for our nuptials. I was thinking we might go to Silver City." "There's a proper church there, and nobody knows our history." Brody nodded. "Silver City it is. We could go next week after we move the herd to the north pasture." "So soon?" A pleasant nervousness fluttered in her stomach. "Unless you need more time." She shook her head. "No." "No more waiting." She smiled up at him. "Next week I'll become Mrs. Brody Grayson." He kissed her again, slower this time, a promise of all that was to come. When they separated, the stars had emerged in the deepening twilight, the first crickets beginning their nightly chorus. "I should go," Brody said reluctantly, standing and pulling her to her feet. "Before I forget my gentlemanly intentions." Annabelle kept hold of his hand. "Or you could stay. In the house, we are engaged after all." The conflict on his face was almost comical. "Annabelle." "Just to sleep," she clarified, though part of her wanted more. "It gets lonely in that house at night." His resolve visibly weakened. "If you're sure." "I am." That night they lay side by side in her narrow bed, fully clothed, hands entwined between them. They talked in the darkness about their childhoods, their hopes, the life they would build together. Annabelle learned that Brody had been a Texas Ranger before his sister's death had soured him on the law, that he'd fought briefly in the war despite being too young, and that he dreamed of breeding horses as well as cattle. In turn, she shared memories of her mother who had died when she was 12, of learning to run the ranch alongside her father, and of her secret hope to someday have children of her own. "They'll be beautiful," Brody murmured, his voice heavy with approaching sleep. "Smart like their mama." "And brave like their father," she added, squeezing his hand. He drifted off first, his breathing deep and even. Annabelle lay awake a while longer, marveling at how life could change so completely in just a few short months, from despair to hope, from isolation to connection, from ruin to whole. The week before their wedding passed in a flurry of preparations. They traveled to Silver City to arrange for the ceremony, purchase rings, and secure accommodations for a brief honeymoon. Annabelle bought a simple but pretty blue dress that brought out her eyes, and Brody invested in a new shirt and string tie. Small preparations for a momentous occasion. The morning of their wedding dawned clear and bright. They made the journey to Silver City in comfortable silence, each lost in their own thoughts about the step they were taking. The church was small but welcoming, the minister kind and unquestioning. 2 locals were enlisted as witnesses, and under a stained glass window depicting the resurrection, Annabelle Norwood and Brody Grayson exchanged vows and simple gold bands. "You may kiss your bride," the minister announced with a benevolent smile. Brody lifted her face to his with gentle fingers beneath her chin. "Hello, Mrs. Grayson," he whispered before claiming her lips in a kiss that made the witnesses blush and the minister clear his throat. Later, in their hotel room, all pretense of restraint fell away. Years of loneliness, months of growing attraction, and weeks of anticipation culminated in a passion that surprised them both. Brody's hands, so capable on the ranch, proved equally skilled at unlacing her wedding dress, while Annabelle discovered in boldness she hadn't known she possessed. "Are you sure?" he asked as they stood beside the bed, her dress pooled at her feet, his shirt discarded. In answer, she pulled him down to her, wanting to erase the last barriers between them. What followed was a revelation, not just the physical pleasure, though that was powerful beyond her expectations, but the emotional connection that transcended words. In Brody's arms, Annabelle felt not ruined but reborn, cherished for exactly who she was rather than judged for what had happened to her. Afterward, as they lay tangled together in the fading afternoon light, Brody traced lazy patterns on her bare shoulder. "Happy?" he asked. She smiled against his chest. "Completely you, more than I thought possible." He kissed the top of her head. "Never expected to find this a wife, a home, a future worth fighting for. And to think it all started with me shooting a man," she mused. His chest rumbled with laughter. "Remind me never to cross you, Mrs. Grayson." "Oh, I think you're safe." She propped herself up to look at him. "Though I make no promises about not shooting anyone who threatens what's ours." "That's my girl," His eyes darkened. Speaking of what's ours. How do you feel about expanding our family someday? Not right away, but I'd like that, she said softly. Very much. He pulled her down for another kiss, which quickly rekindled the passion they'd only recently sated. Their wedding night stretched into the following day, the outside world forgotten as they lost themselves in each other. When they finally returned to the ranch 3 days later, it was as true partners in every sense. The gossip in Redemption Springs intensified briefly at news of their marriage, but without Chambers to fan the flames he had, as Annabelle predicted, left town shortly after their confrontation. Interest eventually waned. Autumn brought the cattle sale, which yielded enough profit to secure the ranch through winter and allow for improvements in the spring. They celebrated Christmas in their cozy home, exchanging modest gifts and making plans for the future. By February, Annabelle's suspicions were confirmed their family would indeed be expanding before the year was out. "Are you sure?" Brody asked when she told him, his face a mixture of joy and concern. The doctor in Silver City confirmed it yesterday. She placed his hand on her still flat stomach. "We'll meet our child in late September." He gathered her into his arms, his eyes suspiciously bright. "I never thought," he cleared his throat. "After Sarah, I never thought I'd have a family again. You've given me back so much, Annabelle." "We've given each other back our lives," she corrected gently, "made them whole again." The months that followed were busy ones. Brody insisted on building a proper nursery addition to the house, and they hired 2 ranch hands to help with the physical work Annabelle could no longer manage as her pregnancy progressed. The ranch flourished under their combined leadership, gaining a reputation for quality stock and fair dealing. Occasionally, they would ride into Redemption Springs for supplies, where they were now met with cautious politeness rather than outright hostility. Annabelle's visible pregnancy seemed to soften some of the town's judgment. Nothing redeemed a fallen woman quite like impending motherhood within the bounds of matrimony. Not that she particularly cared anymore. Her life and happiness no longer depended on their approval. On a warm September evening, as the first stars appeared, Annabelle Grace Grayson came into the world after a difficult but ultimately successful labor. She had her mother's blonde hair and her father's storm gray eyes, and from the moment Brody held her in his trembling hands, she owned his heart completely. "She's perfect," he whispered, awestruck by the tiny life they'd created, just like her mother. Annabelle, exhausted but radiant, reached for his hand. "I was thinking we might call her Sarah, after your sister." Brody's eyes filled with tears. "Are you sure?" "I am," she smiled at their daughter. "Sarah Norwood Grayson, a beautiful name for a beautiful girl." As Brody carefully placed their daughter in Annabelle's arms, he marveled at how life had brought him to this moment, from a drifting cowboy with a troubled past to a husband, father, and rancher with deep roots, and a future bright with promise. "I love you," he told his wife, his voice rough with emotion, "both of you more than I have words to say." Annabelle looked up at him, her eyes shining. "Then show us every day, that's all we need." "Every day," he promised, "for the rest of our lives," and he did. Through the years that followed as their ranch prospered, their family grew to include 2 more children, and their reputation spread throughout the territory. Brody Grayson kept the promise he'd made that day in the mercantile. He loved what others had called ruined, and together, they built something beautiful and whole. Redemption Springs eventually came to see what Brody had recognized from the beginning, that Annabelle Norwood Grayson was a woman of extraordinary courage and dignity. The whispers faded, replaced by respect for the thriving Grayson Ranch and the family that ran it. But even if the town's opinion had never changed, it wouldn't have mattered. Annabelle had found her redemption not in their acceptance, but in the love of a man who had seen her true worth when she'd forgotten it herself, in the children who carried forward the best of them both, and in her own heart, finally healed from old wounds. On their 20th wedding anniversary, as they sat on the same porch where Brody had proposed, gray now threading both their hair, he asked her a question. "Do you ever regret it, accepting my offer that day?" Annabelle smiled and leaned against his shoulder. watching their youngest son break a spirited colt in the corral while their daughter sketched the scene from beneath a cottonwood tree. "Not for a single moment," she replied. "Best decision I ever made." Brody pressed a kiss to her temple. "Mine too, Mrs. Grayson. Mine too." In the distance, the sun set over land that had once been barren but now thrived under their care, much like the woman once called ruined, who had found in love's patient hands the power to become whole again.